Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello and welcome to episode 185 of the Criminologist Podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. This week, we are joined once again by our good friend, the esteemed Dr. Jerrod Brown. Today, we are addressing an issue that many of you have heard of, but perhaps fail to make the connection to your caseloads and or truly understand to the degree that you should the topic of food insecurity. Specifically, how this topic should indeed factor into your consideration of the complexity of the individuals you supervise or care for. Not only is Dr. Brown going to define the term food insecurity, he's also going to introduce us to related concepts, including those of food deserts and food swamps. And, as he always does, Dr. Brown will include plenty of context for the human service professional. Trust me, I think you're going to get to the end of this episode and say to yourselves, okay, I need to get food insecurity on my radar. And now, joining the Criminologist Podcast right here from our home state of Minnesota, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Jerrod Brown, and I will see you all on the other side. Jerrod, welcome back to the show. How have you been, my friend?
Pretty good. It's been a long time, my friend, and I hear you had some good travels.
I did indeed have some good travels. I was over in Europe, back in Barcelona, specifically, once again, training at the International Training School on core correctional skills. And then I had the honor and the privilege of delivering the keynote address in Sydney, Australia for PCOA, the Probation and Community Corrections Officer Association for that country. So that was a real treat to do the keynote. And then I also did a couple of breakout sessions on our TIDES model, our trauma-informed desistance model. So it was really great to get the perspective of other practitioners around the world. It really does help form my worldview and helps also with me see where we're at on the continuum of evidence-based practices, core correctional skills, vis-a-vis other jurisdictions around the world. So that's always another fringe benefit. Yeah, you will appreciate the model, as I know I've already highlighted some of this to you when I was a student in your trauma resilience and self-care course. Stole a lot from that to leverage that acumen into how we're approaching the populations we serve today. So I owe quite a bit of it to you, my friend.
Oh, thank you, but no, just a small crumb I provided. So
here today, Jerrod, to talk about the topic of food insecurity.
Yeah, I think your audience the light bulb will go on after this one, I think, because it sure did for me. And we're gonna cover some really interesting things, and I'm really call to action. If you are working in the criminal justice system or in the forensic arena or indirectly with folks who commit crimes or are victims of crime, you should learn about this topic. And I have a lot of reasons for that I'll share with you as we go deeper into the weeds.
And as I suspect, Jerrod, the deeper we do go into said weeds, as you said, those light bulbs and mini epiphanies will be going off for many a practitioner, because in preparing rather for this interview, you introduced me to some concepts that I thought, oh yeah, there's a total need for us to do this episode on food insecurity. So let's get at it. Maybe start with your 30,000 feet view, and then we'll drill down deeper into some of the populations that our practitioners may serve and help make those knowledge connections, if you will.
Yeah, you bet. So why I am doing this topic is because I am doing a lot of work in the area of neurocriminology, and in that literature it talks a lot about nutrition, but I'm actually currently working on another master's degree right now in nutrition, and I'm really taking what I'm learning from that program and trying to apply it to the criminal justice lens. That program has nothing to do with criminal justice per se, but I'm really infusing what I'm learning there with my neurocriminology hat. So when we think of, and this is a topic I haven't really thought about up until a few years ago, when we think of food insecurity, think of the food security spectrum. So if you are a household that has secure food access, you have plenty of money, you can make the choice if you want to eat healthy, or you can make the choice if you don't want to be healthy. We're not talking about that today. We're talking about clients that don't have the means, the access, all kinds of things to think about. So think about this on a spectrum. On the most extreme end of the food insecurity spectrum is famine, which you're going to see obviously more in other countries. But when we're talking about the United States, food insecurity is alive and well. It's real. Depending on what study you look at, 1 in 5, 1 in 6 people are impacted by this. That number is astronomically higher when we're talking about people coming out of prison. When you think of food insecurity, think of fear of hunger, or you are hungry. You don't have the means to healthy food, even though you want to eat healthy food. You may live in a neighborhood where there is higher crime. Someone may live in a neighborhood where there's food deserts or food swamps. We're going to talk about those topics as well. But the question comes to mind, if you're listening to this, why should you care about this topic? Because food insecurity is a type of trauma. So if you're doing any trauma-informed work, just imagine you don't know where you're going to get your next meal from. You have kids, and you are terrified that your kids are going to not have access to food. You as a parent now are skipping meals and going maybe all day without eating because you want to save the little food you have left to give to your children. This is a trauma. It is a huge issue. It's a terrifying experience. It can be very humiliating for individuals as well. So there's a lot of shame attached to this and stigma. And it really is a hidden epidemic. It can be difficult to look at someone and say they're food insecure, because you could be working with clients that have access to plenty of food, but they could still be food insecure. So an example would be if you're a probation officer supervising someone on probation, on the surface, this client's always coming to your office, has snacks in their hand, and doesn't ever complain about not having enough food. But you later find out the only food they always eat is drive-through fast food, candy bars, energy drinks, things that are very cheaply made, where they're not getting the proper nutrition and vitamins and minerals and all kinds of things like that. The research points to the fact people with long-term food insecurity are more likely to have chronic diseases. People that are raising children and the children are dealing with food insecurity, it's been related to more developmental delay. Interestingly, too, if you're a mental health clinician, food insecurity could actually lead to misdiagnosis or underdiagnosis, because some people that may come to your office for therapy or drug and alcohol counseling who are food insecure can oftentimes present as if they're hyperactive, they're checked out. And if you don't consider the fact maybe they don't have access to enough food, you may jump to the conclusion this client has a diagnosis that they may not have. Food insecurity is a risk factor for mental health issues. People that are truly food insecure are much more likely to have depression, anxiety. This is a factor to take into account for suicide risk. It's a factor to consider with high-risk behaviors and problematic behaviors. And it may be a contributing factor in some cases to criminal behavior. We'll talk about all of that. Before I jump into food deserts and food swamps, Joe, any questions or thoughts?
Well, I have a question with the food deserts and food swamps, which you half answered already, but I know from experience, unfortunately, a lot of individuals who are just as involved do a lot of their grocery shopping, if you will, at the local Quickie Mart or sort of the combo gas station grocery store, which, as you said, has a lot of those processed foods, a lot of those sugary foods. So I want to hear you talk more about food deserts, food swamps, and then if you could give more manifestations of food insecurity. For example, Jerrod, you mentioned anxiety, depression, any other things that may be misinterpreted by, for example, a probation, parole officer, that they might interpret as one behavior or assigned to one variable when indeed it's also linked to food insecurity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you bet. So food deserts would be, let's maybe start there. What's a food desert? So these would be most of the time, and I mean no disrespect when I say this, a lot of times food deserts would be in locations, maybe like inner cities, things of that nature, where there's not a lot of access to healthy kinds of food. So they have limited access to health foods, affordable foods, and it's disproportionately found in high poverty areas. Neighborhoods that really fall under this umbrella, there's going to be transportation issues, neighborhood dysfunction, a lot of health inequities, social disparities, and people that live in food deserts, the research points to the fact that they are a much higher risk for obesity, diabetes, and cardiovascular diseases, just to name a few. And there is some evidence, too, in the food desert literature that neighborhoods that would be constituted, that fall under this umbrella, there might be higher rates of vacant homes. The unemployment rates in those neighborhoods are much higher, and lower educational levels as well in food deserts. Food swamps are often in an urban environment where there are few grocery stores. So maybe a lot of grocery stores have packed up, moved out of there, or maybe they were never in there. And these are neighborhoods where you will find all kinds of fast food restaurants, corner stores, and most of the food they sell is like lots of junk food, convenience stores, a high concentration of liquor stores in food swamps. So on the surface, it could look like the clients have access to plenty of food, but everywhere you turn, it's a fast food joint or a convenience store. They're not having access to healthy, nutritious kinds of food that they truly need to feed their body and brain. So those are some basic things to think about with food deserts and food swamps. Your other question, Joe, think about this. If your client truly is dealing with food insecurity and they have a little money and they're required to pay probation fees, court sanctions, what do you think they're going to do? They're probably going to use that to buy food, when in fact on the surface it could look like they're being non-compliant with probation, even though they just don't have the means to do that. Medication non-compliance. If your client is court-ordered to take medications, but they just have a little money left, are they going to spend the money on food or on their copay for their medicine? Those are two practical things that you might want to just be aware of. There is evidence, too, in the food insecurity literature that folks that are truly food insecure are much more likely to go to the emergency room and have medical health issues, which that trickles down. That can be very tricky on maintaining employment, and maintaining housing. And on the surface, if they can't maintain housing or employment, those are technical violations on probation. If the client's court ordered to go to treatment and therapy and they're food insecure and they didn't eat a meal the night before, they went the whole day, their energy level's very low, their memory can be impacted, they may just completely forget to go to treatment the next day. So on the surface now too, we have maybe someone that can't hold a job, struggling to pay rent, and they get an eviction, and they have a difficult time remembering to go to treatment. All of these things can be linked to more probation violations. So if you look at food insecurity literature, it really is a serious public health, a forensic, a clinical, a medical issue. There's varying levels of severity. You can have lower levels, moderate and severe, depending on the client you're working with. When you talk about food insecurity too, oftentimes it's not just the food insecurity, but a lot of times it co-occurs with having lack of access to affordable housing. It's been linked with more social isolation, and it's been linked with more problems with just managing day-to-day affairs. So it's really something to be aware of. There's a lot of categories too, Joe, to be aware of when we're talking about food insecurity. It could be somebody that just doesn't have access to enough food, so they have reduced intake of food every day. It could be someone that has access to food, but the quality of food is not good. It could be inconsistent eating patterns where maybe they binge on one meal a day and the rest of the day they don't eat. You know, we've talked about blood sugar dysregulation. People who are dealing with true food insecurity as well may consume higher amounts of sugar and sodium and processed foods, which again goes to the heart of kind of a lot of things we've talked about in some of your other podcast programs. If you're working in juvenile justice and you're working with a youth who is food insecure, the research points to the fact too that can have profound impacts on their brain health, their social health, their emotional, and behavioral. So if you're working in any facet of the criminal justice system, take into account that this can impact your client's mood, their behavior, their learning, their attention, their memory. And on the surface, it could look like the client is doing this intentionally or engaging in a lot of rule-following problems and things of that nature. Maybe they just don't have enough food and their brains and bodies, again, are not working properly, unfortunately. I've seen some statistics, Joe, that point to the fact that the overwhelming majority of people in prison, when they were released, fall under this umbrella of food insecurity. And if your audience truly wants to take their knowledge to that next level, just go and Google food insecurity in the criminal justice system, or parental incarceration, or domestic violence, or even gun violence. You're going to find literature on all of these topics. I'll break this all down for us in just a minute, but I'll park the brakes there, Joe, and see what you think.
As you were speaking, Jerrod, it dawned on me, and I suspect it dawned on listeners as well, that we could now include food insecurity into that long list of responsivity considerations that practitioners should be aware of. To recap, dear listeners, when we think of the responsivity principle, among other things, I often train this as getting out of this one-size-fits-all approach to address those criminogenic risk factors and consider your client's individual responsivity considerations, which sometimes I frame, Jerrod, as almost as the barriers one has to overcome before they can address those risk factors. And those traditional barriers are things like mental health considerations, motivation, trauma, housing insecurity, lack of transportation. But now I'm saying, well, we could also include food insecurity here as one of those barriers that has to be addressed before you can get at those established risk factors. And I can tell you, as someone who has trained scores of individuals in risk assessment, That's not one of the usual suspects that we throw out to practitioners to tell them, hey, listen, and you just reminded us about the folks coming out of prison. This is a major consideration. And if you have client A who's not suffering from food insecurity and client B who is dealing with food insecurity, your approaches need to be tailored to address those differences.
Yeah, and just assume if you're working with higher risk folks, people that have been in prison a long time, I've seen statistics as high as 70% or higher of folks coming out of prison are dealing with some level of food insecurity. So you're probably running into folks that fall under this umbrella all the time. A couple other things to be aware of when we talk about food insecurity in terms of poor health outcomes. Underemployment has been associated with this. People with long histories of food insecurity, some research indicates that there may be more of an unstable family system environment. People may be exposed to more violence if they're dealing with high levels of food insecurity over the long haul. The research points to that. A lot of times, unfortunately, this is higher when we're talking about racial or ethnic discrimination as well. So lots and lots of layers to take into account. Joe, I gave a talk recently to another group on food insecurity among college students. Just want to point that out because I know some of you might be in college. The rates of food insecurity among college students, way higher than I thought. 40 to 50% of students, undergrad, may fall under this umbrella. It depends on the state, the college, but you will find numerous studies that talk about food insecurity being a real issue among college students as well. So when we get into the criminal justice aspects of this, you kind of named a few of them, Joe, but what are some of the main reasons why food insecurity is so high among criminal justice involved populations? The research indicates social inequalities, huge factor. Social stigma is a big factor. So if you're ever working with individuals that have been in and out of prison, have multiple felony convictions, you can about guess how difficult it can be for people to find employment or stable housing in some cases. So that is a huge factor to take into account. Parental history of incarceration. There are multiple studies that talk about if a child grew up and had one or both caregivers incarcerated, that's a major factor for food insecurity. So parental incarceration is an adverse childhood experience. Depression is very high among criminal justice involved populations, and depression could be an accelerant for food insecurity. The reason for that is if someone is chronically depressed, that can impact their mood, their energy, their drive to find a job. Depression in some cases could drive the bus with really poor eating habits for some individuals. Chronic homelessness, lack of access to health insurance, and social isolation are the big variables that are talked about in the criminal justice food insecurity literature. And a lot of those I think you talk about with the R&R model some. When we talk about this within the context of incarceration, multiple studies talk about if someone is incarcerated, obviously that can result in a loss of income. So we're talking about poverty, homelessness, socioeconomic status. Incarceration in some cases has been linked to increases in chronic disease states. I'm not saying specific prisons in general, but if you look at the national statistics, people that go to prison a lot of times come out of prison more unhealthy. And what that research says, when you go to prison, a lot of times they're not moving a lot, sedentary behaviors, they're putting on weight, they're not eating that healthy. The food they do eat usually contributes to a lot of metabolic issues, inflammation. And going to prison for some people obviously can be very traumatic and accelerate psychological issues, impact their well-being, and really disrupt their overall social connections with people they had on the outside. If you look at this from a parental incarceration lens, Joe, as well, the reasons why parental incarceration may contribute to higher levels of food insecurity is that it really puts added stress and strain on the entire family system, loss of income, household instability, more stigma, social exclusion. The children in households where there's a parent incarcerated may have more behavioral challenges. And then this can trickle down into the parent that is there having more issues with depression, motivational problems, all kinds of different things. Joe, before I go into on the topic of gun violence, this is really interesting. Do you have any thoughts, anything you want me to clarify for your audience?
I just appreciate, as I always do, Jerrod, that the more we broaden our lens of understanding, the more we're embracing a holistic approach to supervise and assist the clients that we work with. And now, obviously, we can throw food insecurity into our quiver of knowledge, that yet another thing to be aware of and another aspect of our clients' lives that we should consider to help them on their trajectory of change.
And one thing I would say is we've talked about a number of different topics. There's a lot of variables. In my opinion, and everything I know about this topic, this should be one that is at the very top of the list. Very, very top. If we're not taking this into account, we're missing so many things, because it is an accelerant for mental health issues, behavioral problems. There was a really interesting study or an article that was published in 2022, and it's titled "The Association Between Food Insecurity and Gun Violence in a Major Metropolitan City." This article, and there's other articles you can find on this too, if you want to start addressing the gun violence problem in the United States, some of these articles talk about you need to tackle the food insecurity problem. This article, it's a really good article. You can find it online, but it talks about if you're working with clients that have gun violence history charges, self-inflicted gun injuries, accidental shootings, firearm-related trauma, food insecurity could be a major factor in some of these cases, because again, food insecurity, high predictor of poor health outcomes. A lot of times it's associated with poor disability status, low income levels, higher levels of poverty, unemployment, lower home ownership rates, structural inequalities, and a lot of housing and educational disparities. And in that article, it talks about starting to infuse food insecurity interventions into targeted violence prevention programs, as well as in-hospital intervention programs. So if you're working in a city and your emergency room departments are frequently seeing a lot of violent behavior, lots of gun violence, things of that nature, it talks about infusing food insecurity intervention screening protocols into maybe reducing gun violence recidivism rates. Besides the gun violence variable, you're going to find a lot of studies that talk about this within the context of general anger, aggression, and violence, child abuse, and domestic violence. So the takeaway point is, if you are working with individuals with severe violent behavior problems, I am not saying everyone that falls under that umbrella is food insecure, but if we believe the research in terms of how many people coming out of prison have food insecurity, could 70% of your clients fall under that umbrella? Maybe. How do you start screening for this, Joe? What are some things you want to be aware of? And just keep in the back of your mind, whatever job you're in, just some questions to ask yourself. If you are working with clients that have a long-standing pattern of having difficulty accessing healthy and safe foods, that's a red flag indicator. If you're working with clients that worry a lot about not having enough food or having access to nutritional food, it is a definite variable to take into account. If you have clients that have a fear that they're going to run out of food before they get their next paycheck, another variable to take into account. If you have clients that intentionally skip meals because they don't have enough food, absolutely a red flag indicator. If your clients go to bed hungry, they don't want to go to bed hungry, but they have to go to bed hungry because they don't have enough food, another red flag indicator. And two other things to be aware of is if your client has a history of committing crimes to obtain food, or they have a history of going to the emergency room when they're maybe not sick, but they know that if you go to the emergency room, maybe they'll get a meal. Other red flag indicators through a general screening lens to take into account. A lot of other things to think about, Joe, but I'll stop there and see if anything else I can clarify.
So yeah, a couple of things. I will work with you to find an article or two. We can embed the links in the description of this podcast, linking, as you said, gun violence and other behaviors to food insecurity. I find that quite fascinating. And then when you were speaking, Jerrod, about how we need to sort of move this up on our list, move this up on our radar, I was thinking to myself, I could survey 100 random POs around the country and ask them, hey, within the last year, how many times did you have a conversation about food insecurity with one of your clients? And I don't think I'd get many responses to that. Again, I just don't think it's on the radar of, even if we frame it as responsivity considerations, that really play a role in the client's probability of success on supervision, probability of success getting through any given treatment program or things of that nature. So definitely needs to be on the mind of practitioners and the clients they serve.
I agree. And if you're working in mental health, if you're working in corrections, there's no harm, I think, to start to learn about this topic, identify people who are food insecure. Because if you go online too, you will find articles in the popular media that there are some probation departments around the country actually having food drives now for their clients. You will find multiple articles talking about if you start addressing this problem, it could play a role in reducing criminal behavior and criminal recidivism. What are some interventions you might want to consider if we want to start moving in this direction? The research talks about becoming familiar with SNAP benefits, Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, being aware of the WIC program, Women, Infants, and Children. There's another program called Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, being aware of food banks and food pantries and home-delivered meal services and soup kitchens in your neighborhoods. But if you go through the interventions specific to food insecurity, it talks about routine screening, very, very important. Being aware, if you're a professional, getting training on this topic, because if you don't know these terms and you don't ever consider the red flag indicators, of course you're not going to ask clients questions. It's not on our radar. So professional trainings can be very, very helpful. Know that if your client is truly food insecure, it can impact their cognitive health, so attention, learning, memory, decision-making, problem-solving. It can impact their social health. It could be a factor increasing social anxiety, social isolation, social stigma, social exclusion. It's been linked with all kinds of physical health issues, mobility problems, chronic pain issues, digestive health problems, sleep issues. Interestingly, there was an article I read, I don't remember when, but they talked about mobility issues could be a factor for some people to be dealing with food insecurity. So for example, if that client is wheelchair bound, they may not be able to shop in a store where they could reach for healthier foods in some cases. It might be a really practical intervention to work with some people to get them connected to a service that could do some shopping for them. If you're working in homeless outreach centers, routine screening for this, because people who are homeless absolutely are dealing with this. Target addictive tendencies, because food insecurity could be a risk factor for relapse on drugs and alcohol. It does talk about that in the literature. It talks also about the importance of tobacco prevention. I'm actually a certified tobacco prevention specialist. And I don't know about you, Joe. There's cases I've consulted on. A lot of clients smoke a lot of cigarettes in some cases. And a pack of cigarettes is very expensive. If they're spending hundreds of dollars per month on tobacco products and they're on a fixed income, that could be a very practical strategy to help that client quit smoking, save money, and have more money for food. That is definitely something to take into account. Increasing positive support systems, stress management skills, even self-compassion interventions, and targeting psychological distress, worry, fear, and partnering with local food banks, food shelves. There's lots of things we can do. So those are a few practical strategies that are talked about in the food insecurity literature. I'm giving a talk. I'll send you a link for a group coming up on the 20th of November. It's a free online training. And I can definitely share other resources. I can share my slides with folks. But this is a topic that you see all the time if you're working with criminal justice involved populations. But unfortunately, how many of us have ever been to a continuing education training on food insecurity in relation to the criminal justice system? I never have. I've never seen one. I've developed one, and I will be delivering it on the 20th of this month. And I hope to develop way more programming on this because the literature is out there. It's clear this is a problem, but it's just not getting disseminated to the good folks doing the work with clients day in and day out.
Jerrod, when you were speaking of the other deleterious effects of food insecurity, particularly as they relate to cognitive abilities, it got me thinking about one of the principles of our TIDES model, which is that if you're dealing with a dysregulated client, you're not going to have success reasoning with that client, planning with that client, or by extension, if you're wondering why your cognitive behavioral interventions aren't getting the traction that you suspect, you need to make sure that client's regulated. By the same measure, I would argue, if you're getting frustrated why your group cognitive therapies aren't getting the traction you think they are, and or even your one-on-one cognitive behavioral interventions with your clients just don't seem to be resonating, it could be because of food insecurity. The other thing, and you've mentioned it a couple times, Jerrod, you've mentioned social isolation as a variable for individuals who are experiencing food insecurity. And regular listeners of the show know how much I talk about the value of social support and how much of a variable that is in so many interventions, regardless of the population. But I've said this time and time again, people with good social support do better. People without it don't. And now I'm seeing those links between food insecurity, social isolation, and again, how that's another roadblock that we have to address if we want to assist folks on their pathways out of crime, pathways out of addiction, whatever their change trajectory may be.
Yeah, spot on for sure. It is a huge issue, and there's a lot of, again, stigma, shame, embarrassment attached to this, and it really kind of is like a hidden epidemic, a hidden problem. So again, I don't know how many folks you serve that truly have this, but the research indicates you're probably seeing folks with this all the time, and you are right. It can impact your client's motivation, their thinking. Have you ever skipped a meal? You get a little more irritable, a little more sluggish. What happens if a client has skipped numerous meals over a few days and they're not sleeping and the only food they're getting is a sugar-sweetened beverage or an energy drink or some sort of microwavable dollar food from the gas station? It's not feeding their neurotransmitters. Their brains aren't working properly. Their hormones are off. Their gut is off, the digestive health. all of this wreaks havoc on the body and the brain, and it can have adverse effects on our blood sugars. And when your blood sugars get too low, you're more likely to be impulsive, have self-control problems, and really not make good decisions.
Once again, everything we talk about, Jerrod, these themes just seem to keep cascading in on each other. You were mentioning low self-regulation, which again, we know is a big factor for our clients. So again, another consideration for folks trying to do the good work we do.
Yeah, I agree, and I encourage your audience to reach out to me, please, if you want some more links and resources. And if you want a link to that free training, I can send to you too, Joe. But you would not do your program, you individually learning about this, I think will enhance treatment outcomes, intervention outcomes, and in some cases it can create more empathy and compassion and understanding for maybe why some clients do what they do. And if we can approach it from a holistic standpoint, continuing to do all the good work with the R&R model and the dissidence, trauma-informed care, wonderful things. But if we start including some of these other variables that we talked about through that neurocriminological lens, a biological and neurological lens, it just gives a more fuller, holistic picture, because people are complex. And I can make a strong argument, I believe, maybe it's not, but criminal justice involved populations might be one of the most complex populations to work with because of the high rates of head injuries, the prenatal trauma, the attachment issues, the learning problems, the nutritional deficiencies. And all of this can trickle into more behavioral problems, more inconsistent performance, forgetting to show up to your meeting, telling you as a probation officer something this week. Next week, you meet with the same client, they tell you something completely different. On the surface, is that client lying to me? Are they confused? Or could their neurotransmitters not be working properly because they haven't had a good meal in a long time and they're chronically sleep deprived on top of that? So a lot of layers going on here.
Could not agree more, Jerrod. Absolutely love it. I will leave those links as noted in the episode description of this show. Jerrod, it's always great to have you on the show, and I look forward to your next appearance, my friend.
Thank you for having me back, and congratulations again on all the good work and travels you've had. So,
thanks, Jerrod. Until next time.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure to hear from friend of the show, Dr. Jerrod Brown. Hey, I've left a link to that free training regarding food insecurity in the episode description of this podcast. The training title is Food Insecurity and the Criminal Justice System: Implications for Mood, Behavior, Cognition, Physical Health, and Criminality. That will take place on Monday, November 20th of 2023 from noon until 1 p.m. Central Standard Time here in the United States. And I'll just real quick read the training description. Food insecurity is a major public health issue and has been associated with several short and long-term neurobiopsychosocial negative outcomes. One group often overlooked as it pertains to the topic of food insecurity are individuals involved in the criminal justice system. This training will examine the impact food insecurity has on criminal justice involved populations and its implications for mood, behavior, cognition, physical health, and criminality. Other relevant topics of interest discussed include incarceration, offender reentry and criminal recidivism, anger, aggression, and violence, psychosocial detriments of poor health, high-risk coping strategies, internalizing and externalizing behavioral problems, malnutrition, gut-brain health axis dysfunction, poverty and homelessness, toxic stress exposure, and adverse childhood experiences, among others. Empirically based research findings will be highlighted throughout this training. And again, I've included the link to register for that free training in the episode description of this podcast. Finally, friends, some sad news to share. I was informed just yesterday of the passing of my dear friend and mentor, Dr. Ralph Sarin. Ironically, and perhaps that is not the proper term, but just last week we did an episode highlighting the great works of Dr. Sarin in the arena of assessment. We discussed the Dreyer assessment, which was his pride and joy, and I noted during that episode how Ralph was instrumental in the early chapters of my life when it comes to desistance research. Ralph, my friend, you will be missed. If you had the good fortune of meeting Ralph, please keep his family and loved ones in your thoughts and prayers. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, the topic of desistance from crime, or, of course, our innovative trauma-informed desistance program model known as TIDES. If you have any questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on X. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the podcast. And of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
In my opinion, and everything I know about this topic, this should be one that is at the very top of the list. Very, very top. If we're not taking this into account, we're missing so many things because it is an accelerant for mental health issues, behavioral problems.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.